discussion is aimed to discuss the challenges and possibilities of the psychedelic research. As all of you might have noticed, despite the fact that psychedelic research is flourishing in many countries all over the world, in Sweden they find themselves still in the very early stage of forming the psychedelic research, which is at the same time exciting but also challenging period. So we hope by this panel to motivate the hesitating psychedelic researchers and maybe also warn those who are a little bit too enthusiastic. So I will just very briefly introduce the panelists, which you have probably met during the past 2 days. So starting from the right side, was just speaking Dr. Frederick von Gieseritzky.
Close enough.
Okay, I'm sorry. Who is involved in the clinical trial phase 2 and 3 in cannabis. Then on his left side, Dr. Alicia Dainsford, clinical psychologist. She has recently finalized the clinical trial on MDMA-assisted therapy on social anxiety in autistic adults. On her left side, Dr. Anne Wagner. She's a clinical psychologist and investigating MDMA-assisted therapy, conjoint therapy for PTSD. Dr. Steve Ross, associate professor at the New York University in psychiatry and child psychiatry, and principal investigator of in psilocybin cancer study at NYU. And Dr. David Erizzo, working for around 9 years with the psychedelic research group at Imperial College in London, conducting neuroimaging and psychopharmacological studies of psilocybin, MDMA, and DMT. So I will start with a few questions, and then we will continue with the open discussion. So feel free to comment or ask the questions you wish. And first question on the panelist is, I would like to invite you to share your story of how you got involved in the psychedelic research. And you might comment also on the fact if you have ever regretted that you have done so, or you are really happy that you made this decision.
Am I first?
Yeah, just feel free to talk whoever wants.
Is this on? You hear me? Okay, so I will not disclose my personal story. I will disclose my professional story. Since I guess that since I was successful in making some progress in making Schedule 1 compounds available for to be used in humans in Sweden, I know the founding members of this organization. They kindly asked me if I wanted to be a scientific advisor to this organization, and how could you possibly say no to something like that? And I look very much forward to helping you guys grow and do fantastic research.
So regarding having any regrets, I have my moments, but after a weekend like this, I realize there's just no turning back at this point. Anything that's difficult about doing this work is worth pushing through and forging ahead. I took a very unconventional route to doing this work. It might be inspiring for those of you who are not scientists or clinicians already. I was the project manager in software development when I found out that some of the members of my team were planning to do ecstasy, and I panicked because I didn't want holes in their brain. So I read Julie Holland's book, Ecstasy, the Complete Guide, and read some accounts of young men who identified as having a schizophrenia diagnosis. And those accounts were so compelling, I began to cry, and a feeling just overcame me that I couldn't tolerate the notion that there were these medicines available that they didn't have access to, and I wondered who else might be helped by having, an opportunity to use MDMA in a controlled setting. One thing led to another, and I, out of the blue, I called Dr. Grobe and said, "Is there anything I can do to be supportive of your research?" And we found out that he needed PowerPoint slides because he was still carrying around, no, listen, this is true. He was still carrying around 35 millimeter slides in a carousel that he would take on the airplane. And I said, there's a better way. So that gave me an opportunity to get immersed in the literature, learn a little bit about the history. One thing led to another, and an opportunity to volunteer as a study coordinator opened up on the pilot study of psilocybin-assisted therapy for anxiety reactive to late-stage cancer, and I began as a study coordinator on that study, and witnessing the transformations that I saw in the patients who received the psilocybin. I decided I was going to make a dramatic transition in my career and become a psychologist so I could carry this work forward. So, I have no problem sharing this with you. I didn't begin my clinical training until I was well into my 40s. So there's no need to think that if you're younger that you've somehow missed the boat. There's a lot of work to be done, and I would encourage you to think about whatever your skills are, what can you bring to the table. So,
Thank you.
So I also had a route into this world of psychedelics in a not driven by psychedelics. So I was a postdoc doing PTSD treatment development research. Really knew nothing, to be honest, about psychedelics or empathogens at that point. And I got invited into my mentor's office one day for a meeting, and I knew we were going to talk about like maybe a new study. And instead, she closes the door and says, "How do you feel about going to Charleston and taking some MDMA?" And I said, "What?" So there's a reason for this. So we got invited to be part of the therapist trial. So there is a trial that was going on that allowed for therapists to have a therapeutic experience on MDMA. So that's the fun thing, is I get to actively talk legally about my very first experience with MDMA was in a therapy session. So that was my introduction to this work, those experiences, everything. And I was completely agnostic going in. I wasn't convinced that this was going to be something that would be useful. We'd been researching these different types of treatments for PTSD, and those seemed to be exciting and working. But then after that therapy experience for myself, that was when I got on board. And that was when I decided that this was an area that really merited a lot of attention, and I got really excited. So that's how I started, and that was 4.5 years ago, I guess, and here we are. So that was the route in, and I also I want to put a plug in for, I think, excitement about psychedelics and empathogens is good, and I think we need a lot of strong training and research in fields that support that. So the enthusiasm isn't enough, that we need strong skills to support the enthusiasm. So thus far, I don't regret anything. We'll see when I submit my protocol to Health Canada how that's going to go. So check back with me in maybe like 6 months, and we'll see what I say then. But yeah.
Thank you, Anne.
Thanks.
Well, I told some of the story in my lecture about how I got involved in psychedelics, and it really came out of nowhere. I didn't think I wanted to be a lifelong psychedelic researcher. I grew up in Los Angeles, and my brother and his friends did psychedelics. I knew of people doing it and doing some crazy stuff, and that's the extent that I knew about it. But then Jeff Gus started like whispering in my ear about ayahuasca and something about LSD 50th anniversary, and I was like, what? And so I just started looking into it, and as I said earlier, there was this vast body of research knowledge that was like hidden from my training, and I really thought that's so weird. It was not a small part of psychiatry. We're talking like close to 30 years, tens of thousands of participants, several American Psychiatric Association conferences specifically on LSD. And so the more I kept looking, I kept finding, and I found that addiction was the most studied indication, and I'm an addiction psychiatrist, so that got me very excited. And I had learned about spirituality and religion and addiction and recovery, and this to me seemed like really interesting. And then I started to learn things that were also erased from my training. So 12-step, the guy, Bill Wilson, that got sober in 1934 was from a psychedelic experience with a belladonna alkaloid. No one mentioned that part of the story. And in the 50s, he underwent LSD psychotherapy with Sidney Cohen, UCLA. No one ever mentioned that. So I just got curious, what else is missing from my training? And then Jeff, Alex, and Tony Bosses, out of nowhere, we just formed a group in 2006, and we just kept meeting every day, and then met Charlie Grobe, and then had a protocol, and then Dave Nichols, and the Hefter group. And so we just kept going. I didn't think it would last very long. I thought, okay, yeah, there's a path forward, but there's no money, and like people think this is a career killer. But amazingly, we just kept going from one step to the next, and it was the FDA, and then it was the IRB, and I mentioned earlier the Oncology Review Board almost killed us, and we happened to like barely get through that. But mostly it was much easier than I thought. Most of the people in charge of the institutions that I needed permission, it was a common thing like, yeah, can I get a sample, they would say to me. Like, what? No, thought it was a trick question. But a lot of them had been in the 60s and were sympathetic and then went on to become doctors. And so there was a weird thing of the leaders of my institutions got it in a way I didn't think, and that was surprising to me. And do I have any regrets? I don't have any regrets. At times it's been extremely frustrating that this is taking forever, so complicated politically and bureaucratically, but I'm very persistent and just keep going. And I think for the people here in Sweden, I think that would be my main message, is there's a legal route to do it. So just try and just keep going and don't give up. And if you do that, I think you'll sort of get to it in the end. So
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, as in my way into this, it's slightly boring. It's I was interested in psychopharmacology. I went to New York to a lab that was doing a lot of really interesting schizophrenia, mainly dopamine work. And then there was one of the people in there, Diana Martinez, who did addiction research, and I got more and more interested in that side a little bit more than the schizophrenia. And then basically I belonged back in Copenhagen. That was where I came from when I moved over, went to New York. And that group represented here as well as meeting, Martin was talking earlier today. That group is a specialist in serotonin. And then I was like, okay, drugs, serotonin, it has to be MDMA and psychedelics. So it's a bit that boring way into it, basically, from psychopharmacology and geeky imaging approach to it. So during my PhD, I did imaging in different conditions, but including people who recreationally used psychedelics and MDMA. It was actually an MDMA study, but then I got a lot of people who were more psychedelic users, and then we expanded this study because they were quite interesting, and I got quite curious about all their stories and their experiences, and that was basically my introduction to what psychedelics were. And then after that, I went over to the Imperial Group, not to do psychedelic research actually, but to do dopamine addiction again research. But then Robin Carhart Harris, he just moved from Bristol to Imperial at the same time as I moved from Copenhagen, so we were sitting there, and I remember we went to a meeting with a lot of big professors from Oxford and Imperial and Cambridge, and we were sort of the only junior ones in the room, and we had to introduce ourselves, and it was incredibly awkward, and we felt like running out of the room. But then when I said Robin, he was asked who he was, and he said, "Oh, I'm Robin Card Harris. I did my PhD on MDMA," and which is kind of a weird thing to say in a way. And they said, and yeah, my name is David, and so did I. So we both did our PhD on that topic, and then I was doing my dopamine stuff, and Robin was starting these plans with the psychedelic. But my lucky thing for me, Robin is not a medic, so that meant that even though I was there to do something else, I was happily involving myself in the line of work that Robin was doing together with David Nutt. So basically I was just constantly involved in those studies, and now sort of, building up some of my own studies and trying to get grants to do some of the ridiculously expensive imaging, the PET imaging part, which is difficult to get funding for, and I'm trying to get funding for different studies, and the ones that have crashed recently have been the ones that actually involve psilocybin, so that's very unfortunate, whereas some of the others are more successful. So yeah, I still hope to be able to do some nice PET work in psychedelic science, but I mean the Copenhagen group right now is doing really great stuff with that, so I shouldn't have left. No. Yeah, but anyway, I hope to be able to do it. It's very expensive to do PET in London, unfortunately, so that's a big obstacle for me.
Okay, thank you, David. Yeah, some of you have already touched that topic, but if you could further develop the theme of what are the main challenges or obstructions you have met during the years you are involved in the psychedelic research? Is it money? Is it law or stigma surrounded by psychedelics?
I think I can speak a little bit for the Imperial group. We have the great advantage of being in a group where we work under David Nutt. I mean, and that basically is quite lucky for us. So he, because of his, his credit and his involvement in a lot of different science societies, and his position, he was the chief drug advisor for the British government. So he, of anybody in the UK, he was the person who could push these things through and get the right licenses with the Home Office and so on. So I think Robin in particular, and also myself, we have been very lucky, and the whole group, we are lucky to have David Nutt. So in that way, I mean, for us, yes, there have been a lot of obstacles, and David happily talks about them in a quite political manner in some of his talks. So, I mean, now he's not here, so basically he has dealt with all that in a way for us, so we're a bit lucky to have him as sort of a bulldozer in front of us to make this possible for us. But of course there have been a lot of obstacles. It's very tedious, very bureaucratic. Amanda has also done an amazing amount of work in the UK to push these things through together with David, and also UCL colleagues who have also done important work with difficult compounds. So yeah, so we are lucky to be able to do it, and it has been difficult. It takes years to get a study from the first minute of ideas to get it actually realized because of all the regulations. So it is hard work, and it's very expensive to get the drugs that we need in the right quality to conduct the trials. And that must be the same for all sites, I would imagine.
Yeah, Steve touched on a real key theme, I think, that most of us have experienced, is this work requires persistence. It's definitely a marathon and not a sprint. It requires a lot of patience and willingness to put up with delays and struggles with funding and all sorts of things that come up. But I found it's most helpful to think in terms of taking just persistent baby steps in the same direction, and thinking that we're here on a panel today where there are more studies going on today than I can keep track of globally, and used to be able to count them on one hand not all that long ago. So I think taking the long view and being able to think that obstacles needing to work hard to find funding. It's just part of the endeavor. And if you accept that and can be content with small, measured, responsible steps consistently in the same direction, I'm shocked at how many peer-reviewed articles there are now, how large, the literature base is, how many teams, how many countries. So, yeah, I think part of the hurdles are just sort of internal. Can you put up with all the things that come up along the path and keep going?
Like, I'm thinking about that to make real any clinical trial is a huge amount of work. And do you find it like considerably more difficult to do clinical trial with psychedelics than with other substances? If you have the experience to compare that work.
I can speak to the experience of having done a psychotherapy trial prior to doing this pilot study that we did with the couples therapy with MDMA for PTSD. So I had been involved with the original randomized control trial of that same couples therapy without MDMA. And I mean, regardless on if you're using a psychedelic, an pathogen, anything, it takes a long time and a lot of money to do a clinical trial. And depending on your luck and depending on, the strength of your application, it can be really challenging to get funding for these studies. And so, the previous, like the non-MDMA clinical trial was funded by grants, to my mentor after multiple tries of her trying to get those grants. It's kind of a given, when you're trying to make those trials work. And then I think we've been fortunate that, we stepped into this at a time when there's been a lot of momentum, and we personally haven't felt the sting of needing to find money. We've been very, very lucky to have really strong financial support from MAPS. So, but I anticipate that won't, it's not always going to be raining donations. It just seems to be that we walked in at a really exciting and open time. So I do anticipate that will probably be a massive hurdle for us going forward. If you think about trying to run a large psychotherapy couples trial with MDMA, it's going to cost a lot of money. So, I mean, there's that piece, but that is an issue regardless, and if you're using a compound or not in that treatment. So,
Yeah, so one thing that I have found surprising that working publicly with what some might call controversial substances, and the big surprise to me is that not a single person has been angry with me. And it felt really close, actually, Wednesday this week, because I got a text message and it said, police. And it was a short message, and it said, I'm an investigator and I would like to interrogate you. Please call me in this number. And I was like, whoa. So I called the number, and a very nice lady said, I'm a police investigator, and a prosecutor has told me that you're an expert on cannabis, so we would like you to share with us your expertise in a trial. So not even prosecutors are angry.
Okay, so I have the last question on those who wanna respond. Like, let's move to the bright side of the psychedelic research, and if you could comment on what possibilities you see in this flourishing area of research, and what are the possible ways where to go, or maybe to inspire the new researchers in this field?
Well, I think that we're at the dawn of like a very exciting time. I think a new field is about to be born, and we have so many people who are interested in getting involved. Research is one way to do it. It's a limited way because there's relatively few places, but that's changing. And there's so many interesting directions to go with psychedelics. If you're interested in therapeutics and helping people with mental illness and addiction, and you're interested in psychedelics and psychotherapy, there's so many interesting directions. They're kind of like limitless. So there's so many different ideas. But the other thing, and this was my last slide, is I really think within the next 5 years, these medicines will be available, at least in the United States. And I think that'll radically change psychiatry. I think it'll have to be done properly. But you'll have people who are interested in being psychedelic clinicians who will have to go and get training, but then they'll be able to treat patients in a supervised psychedelic clinic and to do it properly. And that really opens it up for a huge number of practitioners to get involved in work that's really interesting. For me, what changed me, I worked with interesting patients at Bellevue. My most favorite patients are the psychotic patients, and I really love treating them, and it's difficult and profound. But the cancer patients in our trial really changed me. There was something, because I'd had a very bad experience as a medical student with cancer patients where there's just more chemo up until the very death. There was definitely not a good death for them. But the patients in our trial, had such remarkable changes. And at first I couldn't believe it. I thought they were like lying or something like that. But after we did almost 30 people, you can see how significant their lives change. And we would, go to people who were dying and they had come to peace with it. That really changed me, and it got me to think this could be a very important part of medicine, especially in hospice settings for people who are dying. So I think PTSD, I think MDMA for PTSD is a really, really great indication. And, that's a very difficult disorder to treat. And MDMA is, it's almost remarkable what happens. 2 out of 3 with severe PTSD don't meet symptoms anymore a year in the pilot data. So this is, if you like putting your nose in difficult to treat disorders and you're frustrated, I think these tools really can help make a difference over time. So I'm excited for the future and the opportunities for people.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for the motivating message.
Yeah, I think you can also, I was just thinking about that it can change how we're thinking about doing treatment. I mean, the idea that, the 50-minute hour of a psychotherapy session is the model that we work with. At the end of the day, is that really, how effective is that? How long is that going to last? What does that look like? The fact that or the idea that someone's taking a medication daily for forevermore, right? So the idea that we can both condense psychotherapy and use 1 or 2 doses, maybe 3 doses of a medication, that really changes the face of what a treatment looks like, right? And I think that there's the possibility that we can actually move towards treatment of things in, what we try to do in other ways is like episodic care, like you treat something, and then if you want support and growth and exploration, that's something else altogether. But that, that the idea of living with particular disorder doesn't have to be an ongoing thing that you're constantly searching for answers for. So I think there's a lot of possibility. And also, this is a very young field. Like if you think about other areas in terms of pharmacology, in terms of medications, in terms of psychotherapy, that sometimes when it feels like, okay, what's the next question? There's an easy line. Here, there's basically every question is open to be answered. Like there's every route, every possibility. We don't know, a lot of what's going on. So I think there's so much space for a lot of brains, a lot of different ideas to come to the table. And I really want to put a plug in for diversity too within this field. So I think that's the future also of this area. Folks of different ethnicities, folks of different genders, folks of different sexual orientations that all need a place at the table.
So was part of the question advice to younger people wanting to enter the field? So my advice would be to go to school, get a degree. I know it's a boring answer. But and then go to grad school and get a PhD, because a PhD is an amazing door opener. And I only wish I had realized it sooner, but it is.
Yeah, I think I would refer back to the last night's panel, where some of the panel members, including I think Amanda, Charles Grubb, and David Nichols, were quite optimistic and said now the ball is rolling. We are sort of tipping out on the good side, in the sense that a lot of important studies have been done, solid work that seems to have, made the avalanche roll in a good way. So a lot of studies are certainly possible. It's really spreading. I think all that is I agree with that, and I think it is happening, and it's difficult to stop now. We just need to keep on being cautious and very sane about what we are looking at and how crazy we are going to go in terms of how we're going to study these drugs. And I think already for a few years back to this meeting, there has been so many amazingly interesting presentations. A lot of work has really become more and more sophisticated. I think at some point a lot of it was about using a lot of rating scales. Suddenly it becomes a bit more neuroscience-y. We're trying to make more tasks and tests and actually try to find the neurobiological basis of some of these things that are, it's interesting and fine with just a questionnaire, but I noticed a lot of what the Swiss groups are doing. They're really going more into depth in what is actually happening, what are the mechanisms, and we try to do the same. A lot of groups are doing the same. Dave Nichols and others are trying to understand the more molecular mechanisms. It's moving actually really quickly forward, I feel, which is amazing, but there's still tons of things to try to understand better, to break some of the things down. What is a challenging experience? It's not maybe enough just to rate it as a challenging experience. What if there's a breakthrough through the therapy? What does that mean? How do we get closer to understand these things better? And all the groups are trying to sophisticate and expand this understanding, and I think that's incredibly exciting. Yeah, so it's a really exciting field to be part of, and there's tons for everybody who want to get involved to do. We just need some more money, right, all of us, but yeah.
Thinking very broadly, one thing that I contemplate quite a bit is that I think it's realistic to anticipate that should these substances become legal as prescription medications, off-label prescribing will be taking place like nothing we've ever seen. So I think there's value in getting some literature published on all sorts of indications, anticipating. We can get caught up for market-driven reasons and so on, trying to push towards legalization. But having some solid research to support all sorts of indications will be valuable to the people who eventually will be in the position to prescribe. So that's the big picture, taking it one narrower level of the current research going on. I personally find the substance dependence and addiction research is such a promising area. I've had nothing to do with it, but I just watch with appreciation and respect for the people in that niche. I think that holds so much promise. And then narrowing it down, I tend to be someone who focuses on little niche interests. I look to the populations who aren't being served well elsewhere and think, what could these medicines do for them? And for several years, this is my idea I hope someone will steal, because I don't have the bandwidth to do it. When I heard about the statistic of suicide attempt rates amongst trans individuals, that it's at about 41%, I just immediately thought of MDMA. And I would really love to see that study get funded and underway. I've talked to some people who have some interest, but that's just one thing that's occurred to me.
Thank you. Now there is space if any one of you want to give a comment or a question. So please again approach the microphone there on the left side on the table. And meanwhile, just a short technical question. I don't have any track of the time. So if you can just show me maybe 5. Okay. when should we finish?
In about 10 minutes. We're running a little bit over schedule, so let's go for 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, hello. I have a question about stigma. Do you ever run into stigma, like in general population, and how do you handle it? Do you have any tips for us Swedish people that encounter it strongly?
So, being fairly new to the area, I interestingly have not really received a ton of stigma around the work that I do. And I think it's specifically because I'm often framing it as, you know, this is an extension of what I was doing, and now we're trying a new treatment, and there's this, you know, we're using MDMA. And so the idea that seems very approachable, the idea that it's being used in this way. So I know that doesn't answer the idea when people are using psychedelics for growth and exploration in other ways, but certainly that makes the conversation approachable for folks, because it feels like people can wrap their head around the idea that, like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. I have encountered, not tons, but a bit of stigma within academic circles. So in some ways, you know, I've definitely had the career advice, if you will, that this is, are you sure you want to do this at your stage of career? You're just launching, that might close doors. And then me going like, sure, no, okay. And then also the opposite, where people are fascinated, and, you know, the idea that you're like, great, you can take the risk, we want to hear about it, so we'll invite you to talk to us. We're not necessarily going to do that work, but we certainly want to hear about what you're doing. So I think it's the entry point in how people are talking about it that can really help destigmatize the area. Mm-hmm.
I found in the United States it's very helpful to just mention that the government regulatory agencies have given us their blessing. You cite the FDA said it's okay, the DEA knows what we're doing, and they're providing oversight. That gets you 80% of the way there. And then being very familiar with the published research literature and being able to say, oh, there's an article in such and such journal, would you like me to provide you with a copy? And so just grounding in other reputable, you know, institutions or publications is helpful.
I might mention here that, so I work in the UK. UK has a history of having a pretty harsh media. So, I mean, so far the response to the trials, to what Robin has presented, and David Knott and Amanda and so on, has been received really positively by the media overall. But then you're always waiting for, at some point there will be some nasty stuff, somebody trying to put a really critical, and that actually happened earlier this year. There was an attempt to make a very critical article about this crazy line of science, and I read it online, and I was like, oh, and then the comments were actually quite interesting. So the readers of this really pretty crap newspaper, the readers, they were all like, hey, what a bad article, it's really important. So basically every comment, people were actually supportive of the work, and not very supportive of the sort of angle of that article, which I found quite interesting, and that made me feel, okay, you know, even a critical article is okay, because people don't really buy it necessarily. They can see that it is solid and sound and important what's going on, and so hopefully that will continue like that.
So my question is, I've been on the MAPS listserv for students, and probably 95% of the traffic on that is, I want to study, I want to get into this, how do I find a position? So my question is, I know we have one vote for go get a PhD, right? But for those interested in getting into this field professionally, how do you recommend about how to go about doing that, especially with so few labs around the world doing the research, you know, and how difficult it can be to get into a facility that has a researcher or a mentor willing to take you under their wing or whatnot? What would you say?
Well, we get this question a lot, and so I think my take on it really is, for example, if I'm, so starting a new study. So I'm always looking for people who have expertise in the thing that I'm treating, right? So it's less about expertise in psychedelics, has far more to do with who can treat PTSD, right? So I'm looking for skilled clinicians who are like awesome therapists, or I'm looking for amazing lab managers. I'm looking for, so I'm looking for people with skill sets that complement the idea that we're working with MDMA, as opposed to taking on someone who's really into psychedelics. That helps, but I need the other skills. So it's more I think, specifically thinking about psychotherapy trials with compounds, having skills, and I think this, ties into the PhD example, like the idea that the education around it or a skill set is really important. And it doesn't necessarily have to be for those folks who are not clinicians in the room. We don't just need clinicians. We need accountants. We need lawyers. We need, regulatory folk. We need folks with all different skill sets. So it's more the skill and idea you bring to the table, I think, is the main thing. That's what I would offer.
I would suggest that if you can't find the position you're looking for, then create it. Start and team up with a couple of colleagues, and preferably some senior guys, and start your own company or business and do your stuff.
Yeah.
I can highly recommend it.
Early on, I was approached frequently, how do I get into the field? And I would say, what field? If you're interested in building something, get in here. But first, become really good at something. We need people who have honed their skills and are bringing something to the table. I think this next wave is a bit young to have a lot of mentorship. There is no track or path. It's growing, but it's very exciting in the sense that there's an opportunity to help build something new.
Yeah, I think also yesterday, or was it today, Dr. Goss in his talk said something I think quite important about it's a bit of a infected area to step into, talking about this thing about the therapists, the guides in the trials, and in the future, what background and what level of training and so on. I think it's a difficult topic because people will disagree. And sitting here, because I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a medic, I can easily make it sound very medicalized. And I don't think it should just be doctors, but I think if you are dealing with mental health, even if it's psychedelic therapy, I think it's really important to have a proper, solid therapeutic background of some sort, to be completely honest. This thing about a few-day course, as Dr. Goss also mentioned, of course that's useful if that's adding on the specific techniques around the psychedelic, but it probably should be built on top of a therapeutic background of some sort to really step into it as a sort of serious therapist in a field like this, because it is still mental health. I mean, it's not just psychedelic therapy yes, if you do it in healthy to see if they increase in well-being, that might be a little bit more straightforward to those trials. They have now been done quite a lot. We're still doing some, and they are important and interesting. But when it comes to the mental health population, I think it really is important to be proper trained in clinical therapy. I might have a lot who disagree. I'm waiting to be, attacked. But what do you think?
I totally agree with that. I think that you really need to be an excellent clinician for many years who is taking care of patients. To me, that's the ideal person to do this work. It's very exciting, and young people want to know how, as expeditiously as possible, they can become a psychedelic therapist. And you would never very quickly become a therapist for anybody. It's a long, slow, gradual process. So I think the people that are best suited to do this work are senior clinicians that have very good clinical skills. At the same time, there may be ways for people to get, you know, something more intensive and quickly that's specific for psychedelic therapy. But having a background in general mental health and addiction is invaluable from my perspective. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. To Anne's earlier point, though, that there's a lot of different types of skill sets needed. For those of you in the room who may be involved in media, there's a real need for journalists to do their homework and be able to write and report on the research and the effects and so on. That's been one of the biggest hurdles that I've had to deal with personally, was irresponsible media misrepresentation of our work. It's been one of the most exhausting aspects of running the clinical trials, is hunting down reporters and asking them to please make an appeal to their editors to change a sensationalistic headline, or telling them how the way that they've quoted us out of context may pose a public health risk, you know, implying that we're somehow treating autism with MDMA. That's a dangerous message. So we need all sorts of professionals, not strictly clinicians, to support the larger effort. So just make that point.
Okay, so yeah, looks like we ran out of the time. So thank you all the panelists for the inspiring discussion.